This story begins in the quiet, forest-lined town of Redwater. A place where neighbors knew each other by name, kids rode bikes down the same cracked pavement their parents once did, and local gossip was usually about church bake sales or who won the weekend fishing contest. But there was one subject everyone avoided. One house everyone pretended wasn't there. The old, sagging structure at the end of Marrow Creek Road. Everyone called it the Morrow Place. For 20 years it stood untouched. Not sold. Not renovated. Not visited. Just waiting. Even the bravest kids, who would climb abandoned barns, sneak into drain tunnels and dare each other to knock on strange doors, would never approach the Morrow Place. Every time they tried they got the same feeling. Like someone was watching them from behind the cracked windows. Like something inside was holding its breath. The official story was simple. The homeowners, George and Lillian Morrow, had disappeared. No bodies. No clues. No witnesses. Just gone. People whispered theories. They ran away. They left the country. They were murdered. But most people knew better. They just didn't want to say it. Because the house felt wrong. The kind of wrong that vibrates in your bones. The kind of wrong that makes animals shake their heads and walk the other direction. The kind of wrong that feels alive. The day everything changed. For 2 decades, the Morrow Place sat rotting like a carcass on the edge of town, until a construction company bought the land. They planned to demolish the house to make room for a new row of duplexes. It should have been an easy job. A simple teardown. But the moment the crew arrived, the first worker said something was off. He swore he felt like someone was watching him from the upstairs window. He told his teammates. They laughed. But none of them walked beneath that window. The foreman on site was Clark Jensen, a no-nonsense man who believed in schedules, paperwork, and getting home early enough to see his kids before bed. He walked the perimeter of the house with a clipboard, making notes like he did on every job. But even he couldn't ignore the strange stillness around the property. No birds. No insects. No wind. Just silence. Clark tried the front door. Locked. Expected for an abandoned house. He motioned for one of his workers, Tim, to break it down. Tim swung a sledgehammer into the old wood. On the third hit, the door gave way, and that was when the smell hit them. It was like a wave of cold, stale air that had been trapped for decades. Rot, dust, and something faintly metallic. Even the toughest workers gagged. Something had died in there, they joked. But the joke didn't land. When the men stepped inside, they realized the house wasn't empty. It looked frozen in time. A coffee mug with dried powder at the bottom still sat on the counter. Plates remained on the dining table, covered in a thin gray fur of dust. A newspaper from 20 years ago lay open on the sofa, the ink faded, the edges curled. This wasn't a house that had been cleared out before an escape. This was a house where life had stopped suddenly. Clark called out, "Check each room. Make sure the floors are safe. Then we start tear-down planning." But almost immediately the workers found the first sign something was wrong. The stains in the living room. The men walked into the living room, stepping over debris, until one of them pointed at the carpet. A dark, faded stain. Too dark. Too wide. Too familiar. One of the men crouched down and whispered, "Looks like old blood, boss." Clark didn't want to admit it out loud, but he knew. It was too big to ignore. He told the men to keep going. At the end of the hallway they saw something even stranger. The wallpaper was scratched, peeled away like someone had clawed at it with fingernails. Long marks. Deep, desperate ones. One of the workers muttered, "Animals, maybe raccoons." But the scratches were too high, too straight, too controlled. And they weren't alone. There were scratches on the floor. Scratches on the door frames. Scratches on the ceiling. Something had happened inside this house. Something violent. Something frantic. Clark swallowed hard. He was starting to think the demolition job wasn't going to be simple. The worker who went too far. Around noon, while the crew took a break outside, one worker slipped back inside the house. His name was Tim Carter, and he prided himself on never being scared of anything. He loved haunted houses, ghost stories, and all things creepy. He said fear was just a trick of the mind. But the moment he stepped back into the Morrow Place, alone, he felt a strange pressure settle onto his chest. Still he pushed forward. A small thrill ran through him. He wanted to explore. The upstairs hallway was narrow, the carpet stiff with dust. 3 bedrooms lined the hall. 2 of them were exactly what you'd expect. Messy, abandoned, untouched for years. But the third room, the room at the very end, the dust on the floor was disturbed. Not just a little. Completely. There were footprints. Bare footprints. Walking in circles. Some fresh enough that the dust hadn't settled back down. Tim froze. Something didn't make sense. No one had been upstairs yet. The crew had only been inside for a couple of hours. No animals would leave human-shaped footprints. He should have turned back. He should have yelled for Clark. But Tim stepped into the room. There was a small closet in the corner. The door was slightly open, but a metal latch kept it from swinging all the way. He pushed on it gently. Locked. Why would a closet in an abandoned house be locked? Tim whispered to himself, only one way to find out. He ran downstairs, grabbed a crowbar and returned. With one heavy pull, the latch snapped open. The door swung inward with a groan. Inside was a single wooden chair. A child-sized one, facing the back wall. Tim's flashlight beam climbed the wall, and he felt his stomach drop. Dozens of scratch marks. Hundreds of them. Carved lines stacked in rows. Like someone had been counting days. Next to the chair was a rusted metal chain bolted to the floor. A chain long enough to reach the chair, but not long enough to leave the closet. Tim staggered back. This wasn't a storage closet. It was a holding cell. A prison. He yelled for Clark. The house becomes a crime scene. Within 20 minutes, the property was surrounded by police tape. Redwater hadn't seen this many officers in decades. Detectives swarmed the house. Forensic teams took photographs. Neighbors stood behind the tape, whispering, crossing themselves, refusing to look directly at the house as if it were a living creature. But the most disturbing discovery hadn't been made yet. An officer in the kitchen noticed something unusual, a faint square outline in the tiles, barely visible under layers of grime. A trapdoor. He called it out and a crowd of officers gathered. The door was pried open, revealing a black hole in the floor. A wooden ladder led down. The air from below was cold and damp, like stepping into a centuries-old tomb. Two officers descended with flashlights. Their boots hit packed dirt. Then their lights swept across the walls. Scratches, drawings, symbols, and words scrawled over and over again. Don't let him in. Don't let him in. Don't let him in. And then one of the officers screamed, "We've got bodies." Two human skeletons sitting upright, chained to the wall. Still wearing fragments of clothing. Still wearing what were once wedding rings. George and Lillian Morrow. But the officers didn't speak. They couldn't. Because next to those two skeletons was a third chain. Broken. Empty. Someone else had been down there. Someone who had escaped. Someone who had never been reported. Someone who could still be alive. When the officers climbed back up the ladder, their faces were pale. One vomited. Another had to sit down before he fainted. The chief of police declared the property a priority-level homicide scene, even though the murders had happened 20 years earlier. The news spread like wildfire. The town of Redwater went from silent to terrified in a single afternoon. And the worst part? Not one person could explain who the third captive had been, or where they had gone. The questions that haunted the town. As the sun set, police lights flashed across the house, mixing with shadows that twisted across the walls like living things. Reporters arrived. Detectives asked questions. Forensic teams worked through the night. Everyone wanted answers. Who chained the Morrows in their own basement? Why had no one heard anything? Who was the third captive? How had they escaped? Why had they never gone to the police? But there was one last question. The one that kept the entire town awake that night. If someone escaped, they broke their chain. They survived. Were they still coming back to the house? Because of the footprints upstairs. The disturbed dust. The recently moved debris. Someone had been inside the Morrow place not long before the demolition crew arrived. Someone who didn't want the house torn down. Someone who still visited. That night, one of the workers swore he saw a dark figure standing in the tree-line behind the house. Tall, thin, unmoving, just watching. When he blinked, the figure was gone. Whether it was real or fear playing tricks he couldn't say. But something evil had lived inside the Morrow place. Something evil had happened beneath it. And something, to this day, remains unaccounted for. 20 years of silence. And the truth was only beginning to surface. The discovery of the two chain skeletons should have been the end of the mystery. But for Redwater, it was only the beginning. Because the third chain, the broken one, changed everything. The police believed the unknown captive had escaped nearly 20 years earlier. If that was true, then the person had been alive while the rest of the world moved on, while the house stood untouched, while the town convinced itself nothing was wrong. But if they escaped, where did they go? Who were they? And why had they never come forward? Detectives searched every missing persons record within 100 miles. There were leads, too many in fact, but everyone hit a dead end. The local news claimed the unknown captive must have been a drifter. A wanderer with no family. Someone who vanished easily. But one detail made that theory collapse. Inside the underground room, the investigators found something near the broken chain. A small wooden pendant. Carved with initials, A.L. The letters were shaky, uneven, cut by someone in the dark with trembling hands. Someone desperate. This wasn't a random drifter. This was someone who had tried to leave a mark. Someone who believed they might die down there, and wanted the world to know they existed. The police released the initials publicly, hoping someone would recognize them. 3 days passed. No one came forward. But then something strange happened. The night watcher. On the 4th night after the discovery, Officer Renee Maddox was assigned to watch the perimeter of the property. Just a routine overnight shift to keep reporters and curious teenagers away. She sat in her patrol car, sipping cold coffee, staring at the black silhouette of the house. Around 2 a.m. she saw movement. At first she thought it was an animal, maybe a deer. But then she saw the shape clearly. A tall figure, skinny, almost gaunt, standing completely still at the edge of the woods. She grabbed her flashlight, stepped out of the car and shouted, "Police, show me your hands." The figure didn't move, didn't run, didn't turn. Just stood there facing the house, almost as if it didn't even notice her. Maddox approached slowly. 20 steps away. 15. 10. She raised her flashlight and the beam hit the figure's face. And she froze. The man was pale, hollow, with sunken cheeks and terrified eyes. Not the eyes of an attacker. Not the eyes of someone hiding. The eyes of someone who had spent years in darkness. Someone who had never escaped something that happened long ago. She whispered, "Sir, are you okay?" His lips moved. He said something so quietly she could barely hear it. "Don't go back in." Before she could respond, he turned and ran into the woods with surprising speed. By the time backup arrived, he was gone. Maddox filed a report. Most of her colleagues said she saw a squatter or a trespasser. But Maddox knew what she saw. She had seen the third captive. Still alive. Still afraid. The final discovery. The next day, investigators returned to the underground room, searching again for anything they might have missed. This time, one detective noticed a small crack in the dirt floor. He knelt down, brushing the soil away until he uncovered something thin and metallic. A latch. Another door. Everyone held their breath. When they pulled it open, a narrow crawl space stretched beneath the room. Barely big enough for a human body. Inside lay scraps of cloth, fingernail marks, and a broken chain link. This was where A.L. had escaped. He had dug his way out. It must have taken days. Weeks. Maybe months. The officers followed the crawlspace until it opened up through a small hole near the back of the property. Hidden under roots and fallen branches. It was the perfect escape route. And the perfect place for someone traumatized to keep returning to the scene. The police realized something chilling. The third captive didn't avoid the house. He kept coming back. Maybe because it was the only place he knew. Maybe because part of him was still trapped there. Maybe because he was watching, to make sure no one else went inside. And maybe that's why he watched the demolition workers from the tree line. Maybe that's why he whispered to Officer Maddox, "Don't go back in. The house is destroyed." But the fear remains. Authorities decided the house had to be demolished immediately. Not for construction reasons, but because it made the entire town feel like prey. On the morning of the demolition, a small crowd gathered behind police tape. The machines roared to life, tearing into the walls, crushing the rotten wood, ripping the house apart piece by piece. Dust rose into the air like smoke. Within an hour, the house that had held its secrets for 2 decades was nothing but a pile of broken boards and shattered memories. But something unsettled everyone watching. As the last wall fell, a bird's-eye camera caught a figure standing far behind the trees. Then, still, watching. Some say it was just a shadow. Others say it was the third captive saying goodbye to the place that stole his life. No one has seen him since. But late at night, drivers on Merrow Creek Road sometimes report seeing a gaunt silhouette walking the tree line, silently, fearfully, as if guarding something only he understands. The town of Redwater tries to move on. The land was cleared. A new duplex now stands where the house once did. But beneath it, buried under fresh concrete, still lies the broken chain. And the initials carved on a small wooden pendant. Oh, the captive who survived. And the secret that may never truly die.